So I would like for this to be very casual, as I would like for most things. And so who knows something about the GDPR? Okay, most hands. Who has had to deal with the GDPR in their work? Almost the same amount of hands. Who has experienced problems and the GDPR has stopped them from doing something that they want to do? Just a handful of people.
Hang on.
Sorry?
It wasn't GDPR that stopped me. It was someone's interpretation of GDPR.
Yeah, or your own interpretation. Yeah. So, cool. So I'm going to go in between these slides. I'm going to talk a bit about the work that we're doing. And I will generally ask a lot of questions. And please feel free to interrupt me like mid-sentence. And then if I remember what the sentence was about, I can carry on after that. But yeah, it's supposed to be interactive, or at least that's the way I want it to be. GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, it came into effect 31st of May 2018 in the EU. So it's a bunch of rules and regulations. And oh, I should say this, but maybe it's already obvious. I'm not an expert on GDPR. I'm not a lawyer. I'm an engineer and PhD student. And I'm very interested in making things easier for people to understand and to be able to do their jobs in an easier way, where that includes being more open in an easier way. So the GDPR is complex, and I like to understand, or try to understand at least parts that I think could be more useful for people to then use in their jobs. So I'm not an expert. I'm going to say wrong things a lot. So like not the right technical terms for it. So when I say regulation, maybe it's a law, or when I say law, maybe it's something else. But that, and you can please correct me also mid-sentence if that happens. So I'm doing a study. I have to collect data from healthy volunteers, which is the easier way of doing that. And I want to share it because open science is apparently an awesome thing. And there's beds, which is great. And there's a lot of tools that help us to share our data. But there's a lot of things that get in the way is maybe too negative way of saying it. There's a lot of complications. It's a complex challenge. And these things take a long time. And if you say my objective is to share it within a 4-year period, then maybe it gets in the way a bit. But not necessarily fundamentally in the way of it. So for that reason, I tried to figure out how to just do it personally. I think a lot of us do things, you struggle with something personally, and you're like, hey, maybe someone else can use this also. Or maybe I can talk to other people that have similar challenges. I think that's a common approach, I guess. So that's why I started wanting to talk to people who have struggled with similar things. And so this kind of project started for me at the OHP Hackathon, where I suggested a project to work on this challenge, which I'll get to a bit more. But lots of other much more specialized and smarter people have started working on it a long time ago. So definitely this is not the thing that's like somehow saving GDPR struggles in neuroimaging. We're just doing a small part, and hopefully it helps. So I'm going to talk about that and then spread out a bit. So I'm Stephan. I work at Eindhoven University of Technology, and there's my details if you want to contact me. So similar struggles have been experienced by other people. So all the people working with Russell Poldrack and Chris Korbelewski, all of the people, if you're in the open science environment and you do neuroimaging, you probably know of them. They also have identified similar type of problems or challenges rather. And the point there was that you want to share your data, but you have to be considerate or take into account data privacy challenges or restrictions or rules or benefits. And there was not a common way to do that when you design a neuroimaging study, for example. So if I want to say I'm designing a study, I have to write ethical approval documentation, that's the protocol that has to get ethically approved by my ethical review board at my institution. I cannot necessarily use the information at hand to allow me to then share that data because there is no information at hand. This is what these people started working on. The open brain consent people. And when I found this is what I felt like. So I realized that people had already been working on these challenges. So people had already been working on creating templates for wording that you can add to your ethical, to your protocol documentation that you submit to your ethical review board that could more or less be agreed upon in semi-globally as words to use in your documentation, and then hopefully most ethical review boards accept that when they want to give you permission to do the study. And this includes templates for stuff that you put into the informed consent letters, information letters for the participants, and they've also made multiple language translations about that. So it's really cool. There's a site, you can read it. Hopefully you can use it. But we also knew, so I started knowing a bit more about that, and then we said, okay, we know GDPR exists, and it's really confusing. And how does this affect if we want to use those templates in our work or preparation for our work? So we know GDPR is like what? We know there are interpretations everywhere. So the GDPR is, I don't know if it was intentionally, but a lot of people say it was intentionally vague. But anyway, it's kind of vague. It's like you cannot do this, or data has to be anonymized. What does anonymization mean? We don't know. Like it means different things for different people, for different countries. So you speak to someone who's in your position in Sweden or in Finland or I don't know, all the countries in the EU. I mean, this is one. And they say different things. But then also, it's not necessarily that they say what is particular to their country. They also say what's particular to their personality. Like, some people are like, someone used the term data anarchists. So some people are like, no, screw everyone who wants to restrict me from sharing my data. And it's not your data, but like, go crazy. Other people are like, no, we should probably take note of these concerns, etc., etc. So it mixes and matches like we are all human. You add your viewpoint, and it then gets even more difficult to figure out like what is the ground truth for GDPR, which I don't think exists. But we were then like getting together at the OHBM, and I think part of this slide is what I pitched at the project pitch, similar to the hackathons here. And then we got together, a bunch of people. So it was, I think it was 5 or 6. And we have people from Finland, from Sweden, from Germany, from Canada, from the Netherlands. And I'm probably leaving out people now, so sorry if you are one of them. So we brought a lot of experience from different countries and interpretations of GDPR to the table. And we said we want to firstly make it easier for people to understand GDPR, if we can, or we will try. And then improve templates. So try and take what people have done. It's an open source way. People do work, they put it online, and maybe we can improve it a bit for GDPR. So add wording that you can now submit your protocol to the ethical review board, and it includes stuff about GDPR. Like it used to be A, now it's A, but A.1 and A.2 as well. And A.1 and A.2 contains like multiple sentences that alleviates a bit of the concern about GDPR or makes it GDPR compliant. And then also, because I like education, like there's always room for doing something and solving a technical problem, but then educating people on that. So I think that is also worth doing in this context. Yeah, that's stuff. Skip this. Yeah. So that's what I want to say about the project. This is small. Oh, it's not too small. So similar to our hackathon that we have here, this we stole the template for the hackathon from the OHBM. So I created some stuff and say, we want to explain GDPR, we want to work on templates, and we essentially want to look at ethical applications or study protocols that underwent ethical review board the process and got approval, and look at what they added as sentences to their stuff, and then we just add it to the template. So this is what we wanted to do. Some interest, we had a lot of discussion. This is a nice doc that I think if you're interested in this work, you can look at it. Okay, so yeah, I'm comfortable about this because this is my website. I don't want to show you something about me, but it's a very nice place to go to find more information about this, because this is the one place that I've summarized all of this. So there's jsheunis.github.io/projects, and one of the projects is this, Neuroimage data sharing under GDPR. Explains nicely the background, but it also gives useful links that you can go to. One of which is the Google Drive folder, one of which is, oops, clicked on something. Anyways, in the Google Drive folder, you will find this summary doc for core GDPR concepts. So I think if you want to know more and understand and see at least how different people experiencing these challenges think about it, it's a good doc to read through. We've also got a lot of feedback by Robert Oosterveld, who was here previously, on their Gustav. PJ is working in Canada in Montreal. I'm not sure where. Adrian is actually the one working with us who actually comes from a legal background. So it's cool to have people comment on this that are not only like neuroimaging researchers, because we are, I mean, if it's only neuroimaging researchers, we're leaving people out. So the idea here is, can we look at what are the core concepts about GDPR? Like, for example, what is the legal basis you use for processing your participants' data? How do we think about that in terms of preparing for a study? Can we put that into the documentation? What do you have to do? So there's informed consent, there's public interest, there's legitimate interest. What do these things mean? So the reason I said I'm going to start or have a casual thing discussion is because we can go like into any of these topics, and if someone has a question, we can. But I am no expert, so I can talk about it easily, and I know references to people and to places where you can find more information. But I'm not a legal expert on these things. So we try to create these core concepts, and I would like to turn this into something like an information piece or a paper or something. If someone wants to contribute or help out, you are very welcome. Things like the identification is hugely discussed. The challenge that I got is that I went to our data protection team at my university, and we discussed like, what is my data privacy plan for the study? So the way that's typically basically suggested you approach this is you first do a data privacy impact assessment, and this is answering a few small questions depending on how stringent your data protection team wants you to be or are, and like what type of legal basis are you going to use to process the data, what type of privacy risk mitigation factors are you taking into account? Is it privacy by design? Is it by default? Is it by something else? How will you process the data? Like, what is the route? Does it go from the scanner to this infrastructure to where, and where are the possible risk factors? These types of things. So again, we consider this pipeline of your data before it started to be being collected until you want to publish, and we try to see if there are like pinpoints where we can say this place GDPR is important, this place GDPR is important, and here are perhaps some form of templated information that you can use when you present this protocol to your ethical review board. Any questions at this point? or comments? Cool. So what I'm going to do now is go back to something else. So this thing took off, I think, quite nicely. And we, Cyril Pernay, I'm not exactly sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but he also organized in another, this is the wrong branch, this Glimmer workshop. They are working with data for glioma, and I don't know what it is and what it's supposed to do, and it's really serious, but they want to make the data available. And they had this cost action to try and figure out how we can, again, reuse what other people have done to suit their needs. And that was more to then extend the work that we started at the OHB Hackathon and also get more clarification for patient data. Like if you do something like a new study that's a healthy volunteer data, you might consider GDPR risks differently than for patient data. Probably you should, not you might. And does that change the templated information that you need to put into your protocol? What we also considered here is this concept of the user agreement, and that's why it was useful to, did you have your hand up now? Oh, sorry. To have Robert Oostenveld there as well, because he's done a lot of work locally at the donors repository. So they have a nice repository, they keep their data in bits format, and then they can also make that available to people. It's not like the OpenMR site where you can just click download and the data comes to you. It's something where you have to agree to terms. So it's difficult to reach consensus on the GDPR and its application to everyone's different types of data. But one form of consensus we're leaning towards in our small group is that you need a data user agreement or data usage agreement. And this needs to specify what certain restrictions are. For example, not restrictions, just a user agreement. So basically, the one that's implemented here at the donors repository is quite simple and standard. And also, it's I think personally, I think it's easier because they do a lot of healthy volunteer studies. So it is different than the study I do. For example, I can speak to the participants and explain nicely, and generally they're open to the idea of sharing data. But it's different also if you want to retrospectively share data. I think that's one challenge that we really haven't been able to talk about. We've talked about it a lot, and then you kind of switch off when you don't find answers and go back to the easier solution or easier challenge, which is prospective studies. Data user agreement. So you have to include something like, so in terms of the GDPR, someone is defined as the data controller. So that is an example of what we've worked into the template. You need to have a section in your information letter, or what you could call the, now I forget the word, privacy, something, some extra documentation. You could call it also differently per institution, where you describe, this is the data controller, there are their details, they need to be accessible and directly contactable. So, I lost my train of thought there. Data user agreement, data controller, yes. So if you, for example, agree to the data user agreement, the template information that we suggest to be used is something like, by clicking this button, because we want it to be electronic, I agree to and one of this is I become a data controller. And you also submit your details there. So you are then listed as a person or as an institution, and there's also some variability there, like how should you track the institution that uses data, should you track the person that uses data. And I think they made a decision locally here about that, but I can't remember what that is. And in our group, I mean, we don't make rules, we just work on things and try to improve it, so we don't really know. So essentially, we then started using, suggesting that in this open brain consent that I spoke about earlier, there's documentation and templates for including in your protocol to apply for ethical approval. That we also include extra documentation and extra lines of words, one of which, in terms of documentation, one of which is a data user agreement, basically almost fully based on the donors repository data user agreement. And then using the open brain consent documentation, we just added multiple lines and sections when it comes to data privacy. So I can show you what we have been working on there. So this is how we're currently thinking about it, but it's a work in progress, and it's also, there's no consensus. This is like showing you at the start of a project like the mini prototype that always fails or is never the end product. So we're thinking about this kind of setup where you have an ethics application on the left-hand side, and that would, according to what we interpreted GDPR to be, semi-necessitate a data privacy impact assessment. So just trying to figure out beforehand what are the risks to that, yeah.
Does that kind of impact assessment have to happen with every project, or is it's just going to be, my project is not really much different from any other?
Yeah, so I think there's probably perhaps some standard impact assessments that have been done, and they usually also originate not necessarily from the data protection team, but also from within the IT infrastructure, because they have to set up the data handling. So there's generally some things that have been done by institutions, but it definitely depends on the level of maturity of your institution and infrastructure. Yeah.
Maybe you have to do it for every project for which you collect sensitive data.
Yeah.
But then a definition of sensitive data.
But maybe we can talk about sensitive data. So this is one of the things. So before I even get to this, one of the things that people that I've been in most discussions about is where does the GDPR apply, when, because if it's personal, non-personal data, for example. And I've already changed my mind because I learned more things over the past 6 months about this, in terms of whether something is personal. So I started thinking, okay, it's an OpenMR, it's defaced. All the metadata that links it to a person is gone. The link to the original data set is gone, like the key you keep, like your Excel file that says Stephan was subject 7 or whatever. So then it's non-personal data. So that's what I start out in kind of believing or thinking is the right way, but I don't think that anymore necessarily, but I'm also not sure if what I'm thinking is necessarily a good way to think about it. But now the way most of the people act, at least in our group and the discussion, is that there is no anonymized data when it comes to at least brain MRI. So it's always personal data, but you can still share, given that you put some things in place that the GDPR, that we think the GDPR requires. Yes.
Yeah, if I can add to that, so I'm in the local ethics committee of our institute, and here, when GDPR was entered, we had a lot of discussions on how we handle that, but also what does it all mean. And there our privacy guy explained that it's personal data when you can, like, based on also combining data, you can then kind of extract which person that was. So that means if you scan or test even behaviorally, a person, like a group of 10 people, with one person with Dutch nationality that is has the height of 2'12", and there's only one person in the Netherlands who is that tall, then it's personal data.
Yeah.
So.
I would agree with that. Yeah. So, but the point is also there's a lot of discussion about whether by any not reasonable, but by any possible means, you can also still identify that person in future. And then comes the whole thing about discussing this kind of dystopian future where everyone uses deep learning to identify the crap out of everything. And that is generally not a good place to be in the GDPR discussion, but that's where a lot of it leads. And it also, like if people do not understand and the GDPR and they act according to the worst risks, that is the point where you get a lot of like dead stops. Like we cannot continue because MRI data is personal, and then, oh, okay, well, easy, we're not going to share. But I don't think, yeah, there's a question at the back.
In this case, like we can divide it into the ranges, like people who are above 2 meters,
yeah,
and 1.5 to 2, and then in that case,
yeah,
we cannot identify the person, and it still serves a purpose because we just need to know, like we don't need to know exact height, we just need to know this category.
yeah.
Yeah, but when it comes to neural data, then I talked about like neural fingerprints that based on your activity, you can then, with deep learning or whatever kind of machine learning,
Yeah.
you can at one point see which person that was, and that's.
So there's some interesting work that's being done, and I know at least of this one person, Anders Eklund in Sweden. He's doing a lot of work on MRI simulations and trying to identify that and trying to use different classification methods. And there's a few recent preprints out by him and people who do similar work. And probably there's a lot of other work that I'm not referencing now. Yes?
Sorry if I'm interrupting, but is this true for electrophysiology data as well? Because I mean, I come from the electrophysiology field, and I wouldn't be able to identify my own subjects based on the data I get. So so I can't imagine that this applies to electrophysiology data, but MRI data, imaging data, yeah. I learned that too, that even with a bad MRI scan, you could maybe re-identify the person.
Yeah, so, but that's also quite vague, right? Like how would you do that?
Apparently there are several studies out there that say defacing is not enough, and none of the defacing techniques hold up to the anonymization standards in sense of if you have the power, the technological power, you can at least, I think the percentages of these studies were 80% of the images could be re-identified. And that was then, I don't know, I didn't read all of the papers because that topic just came up in our project as well. But apparently this is based on partially skull parts, partially Jurai Zolke identifications, partially bad defacing algorithms that can also, I mean, that was my first instinct when I read about these articles, that I was just hoping that it's just a bad defacing algorithm and that there are actually some out there which could anonymize data.
Because it only also defaces, right? I mean, it just goes here, this part. Yeah, you can cut it or blur or whatever, but there's still the rest of your head also.
Yeah, it's enough if you just have the brain, apparently. So, yeah.
Someone want to comment on that?
I think maybe what Stephan was getting at with this like dystopian future where we can all machine learn, identify everything is like right now, the thing I would like to think is possible is that if I normalize my brains, then I can share them because they're no longer the person's individual fingerprint, gyro, sulci. But even if I don't share the warping template or I'm probably going to share the code that I used to normalize them. So someone somewhere may have a motivation to de-anonymize that. And whether that situation could also be possible for electrophysiology. You know, we don't now, you can't identify your own participants from your own data. But maybe someone in the future could.
But that's what the GDPR is also stating, right? That it's due to the current situation of technology. And I mean, I think the risk with static, and I say static data because I mean MRI and fMRI is also not static, but the risk with static data is much higher than with highly dynamical data like electrophysiology, because if you measure the same subject in the same conditions and even you don't enter the same conditions twice, that's not possible in electrophysiology. You end up with different results. So the risk there to get out something which could be used to identify someone is relatively low. I think
I mean, we don't know how technology develops, so who knows what happens in 10 or 100 years. But for the MRI data, I was really surprised that this means that more or less no imaging data, no imaging data at all can be called anonymized. Which is of course interesting, because if you go 3 years back, everybody said defacing is enough, right? And we have a lot of, so for us, I'm speaking as the HBP right now, and we have this big problem that the Human Brain Project currently cannot show any human data. No, not any, that's not true, but the imaging data we are not putting into a normalized brain. For us, this is a problem, because a lot of people started their projects way before the new GDPR was done. So also the patient consents, right, are not in place. So we don't know how to deal with it on the anonymization process. So there are currently a lot of efforts taken. What does this mean? Does this mean that certain data providers or researchers have to go back to their patients and actually have to ask them for a new consent in order to be able to share their data at all? So, and this also already includes the possibility that they can be shared with a restricted access. But it might be that they're actually not allowed to share them at all, because it's not conforming anymore with the GDPRs we have in place now. And yeah, for me, it's a bit difficult, because I would have expected that the GDPRs were written and then actually people say what to do. Who came up with the rules, and that didn't happen. So for us, being as a data curator who stated this question when the GDPRs came out, we didn't get an answer. So we took what was in place, namely the normal anonymization, and 2 years later, suddenly the DPO decided, oh no, shit, we should take all the data off again. And they are not even in sync, right? So if we have now a discussion between DPO from different institutions, and they disagree also upon certain things. So for me, the whole, I don't know, I think it shouldn't be decided by a community, right? If there's somebody deciding on a law document, there should be rules that actually can be used by the community in order to apply to that. And I have the feeling that's not the case. So I find this really puzzling, and I'm wondering how other people are solving this. Like ethics committees, I was wondering, for example, we require that people have, since we're a European project, we require that people are following European law considering ethics. So, and ethics committees are usually stated in papers. If I have a rare disease and have an ethics committee which is responsible for a certain area in a certain country, I can identify that person. So I'm not sure what we do with those data if we then not state the ethics committee and just anonymize it and say, well, the ethics committee was somewhere in Europe or something, right? So there are these special cases, as you said, with the tall person, right? If you're the only one in that country, then it's of course identifiable. But these cases have to be decided also on the fly with each part, and that also requires a lot of manpower, right? On the DPO side, on the European law side, I'm really wondering if we can handle this in science in general. Sorry, that was really
No, it's useful.
I would like to bring up something slightly different from this, so if anyone wants to continue on this, maybe they can have it first. No. Also related to GDPR, but so does anyone here, you have experience with how to do the wording when you want to share pseudo-anonymized, so definitely not anonymized data with your collaborators, but they are at a different university in a different country?
Yeah, I mean, probably some people here might have more experience than I have, but I generally think that would mean a data user agreement.
Right.
Yeah, so that's
with the other university?
Sure, but I don't know if, Robert, you want to add to that?
So we have explicit data use agreements which are for researchers that want to reuse the data which are not part of the initial research plan. So we do the data use agreements primarily for the publicly shared data. The case that you're referring to is the sharing within the research collaboration. So what we typically do in our informed consent forms is that we already state that the data is going to be shared with people that are working on the same project. So we try to avoid the wording towards the research participants that research is going to be shared with colleagues or with people within the university. So we explain that they're part of a project, so that they're going to contribute their data to a project, that within this project data is going to be shared with researchers that are going to work on this data. And then what we do is we do mention the project partners. Yeah, so we actually, in the, at least that's what we often try to do, it's not always possible. So that means that in the informed consent, we already explained to the participants that the project also comprises another university, but sometimes also comprises another company. So actually we're explaining to our participants that your data is going to be shared with a company. Are you fine with that? And at that moment they can give consent or not. And but that's of course like the ideal situation. Reality is often not so ideal. In reality, what often happens is that the project changes, the scope of the project changes during the whole project, that project partners get added. And that's of course where it gets more difficult, because then we did not inform the participant at the moment that we acquired the data. So we don't have a formal procedure for that in place, but we're still trying to cover that within this idea of that it's part of the project, so it's part of the scientific agreement, and it's the informed consent that is given by the participant is that his data is used for that scientific project. So that's also why we're trying to avoid having data use agreements, because then there's another contractual obligation, which means that there's actually an external party, and we're trying to get the external, like the other university or the other company, we're trying to get them inside the project.
I just want to comment on this, because you said that the wording is very specific, right? And you need to be careful what you say. And I just learned about a project where they actually did everything right. So they can share their brain data they collected, and everything is fine, except for the wording that they put somewhere in there that this cannot be used for promoting issues. So what the people can do is that they can share the data quite openly, but they are not allowed to show a brain image of that brain used as an icon on their website. So they had to take off this image from the website because that's a promoting thing, even though they are not getting money for this, right? It's just an icon of something, but they had to put it down according to the DPO. So it comes down to these like very, very fine phrasings, and we have the same problem. So several patient agreements we now collected because these phrasings are actually not done by necessarily lawyers, apparently, and therefore the phrasings are wrong, or at least according to GDPR now.
So that's also where we realized it's like phrasing is really important, and the GDPR requires that you're specific, and whereas at the same time we try to be as generic as possible. So that's a little bit the struggle, like the tug of war that we have with the GDPR, because if we say that it's going to be used for scientific research, well, so then you also have to think about like what is non-scientific research. Does such a thing exist? Or researchers, like our researchers are those people that are employed by a university. Do you have to have a PhD if you're a researcher? Like it's not that you're going to share with someone who has a driver's license, which is a clear binary decision. Like researcher, someone who's unemployed at home between a PhD and a postdoc, I would still say that's a researcher. So that's what we're trying to, in our informed consent, actually on purpose, trying to be as fuzzy as possible. But at the same time, the GDPR requires us to be specific. And that's also where we, in dealing with specific patient populations, we at this moment we have a Parkinson project, where initially in the informed consent procedure it said that data can be shared for the purpose of Parkinson research. But we're also going to study a whole bunch of elderly control subjects in that project. And I think those elderly control subjects, they're actually interesting on themselves. Also in relation to other studies, not specifically Parkinson. So we're now in an amendment, we're trying to get this changed so that we can actually use it for studies that are slightly wider defined, so not only Parkinson. But that's really the specificity of the wording.
And what I would like to add to that is that the DPOs learn also these things ongoingly. So while researchers figure out, okay, maybe this phrasing is better the next time, maybe a year ago, DPO might have, data protection officer or data protection team might have confirmed that this is fine, and now not. Yeah. So what I want to highlight with what I showed about this open brain consent GDPR is that we want to try and build a community of people who work in this regard to try and improve these bits and pieces of phrasing over time such that we can put a nice resource together that people can work from. That is the main goal. So we have not solved all of these complicated issues. They will not be solved suddenly. But it's good that we work together on that, I think. Yeah, I think we should probably switch over now. But thank you for the conversation. It's cool. Thanks. I put the link up here also to the data user agreement from Donors Repository that you used as the template in Open Brain Consent. But yeah, there's a lot of links, and if you want to know more, please go to Open Brain Consent, read the docs, and there's a lot of stuff. So there's also, so what we use here is this ultimate consent form. And now, once we have the update, which is currently being reviewed on GitHub, we will have the ultimate consent form GDPR version that you can download and see if it works for you. And if it doesn't, please tell us why or join. And also trying to expand the resources. So we have anonymization tools, and we have things like cleaning the headers, but also like defacing, skull stripping, etc. And this also needs to be updated a bit. But you can already see that there's a lot of tools that you could use for defacing. And we also want to add more content that discusses this a bit more. Like, yes, we use this tool, but it doesn't do this because our DPO said it's not cool or something. So have kind of a user feedback on these things so that people can learn more from each other. Thank you.